Apologies, Walter, can you hear me? You're muted on Zoom.
Ah, is that better?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. I was just talking about how everybody talks about video games all the time. And how that is represented in and how the past is represented in video games. But some people will study board games as well and will look back to the history of board games. And if you look at some of the information on Board Game Geek, it'll go back to 1944. So to the 20th century, a lot of people will start talking about the history of board games going back to things like Monopoly or Halma or things like this. Or even Kriegspiel, which is one of the earliest kind of manufactured board games. Yeah.
Can you slow down the live because
otherwise
it's not.
Let me turn the front light off.
Yes.
All right. All right. Cool. Or going to Kriegspiel, one of the earliest games that was invented, or Game of Life here in its original version. The one you're maybe more familiar with was invented was changed from this to in the 1960s. Some researchers will even go back further and talk about the beginnings of games of the kind of popular traditional games, you want to call them that are still played today. So some of the major ones that people are familiar with and that are very popular among researchers are things like Mancala, chess, backgammon, and Go, which go back roughly 1500 to 2,500 years. But the history of games goes back even further than this. The origin of games is as distant from the origin of these games. It's as distant from that as we are to the beginnings of chess. So, or even older. So some of the early games from Egypt and West Asia that you see here are some of the earliest board games that we know of. This here is the oldest object that we probably think that we can really kind of positively identify as probably being a board game. It's in Brussels, so it's not far from here if you want to go see it. It's this clay table. You can't see very well from this photograph. It has 3 rows of 6 squares, and is found in a woman's tomb, which is always a fun fact that I like to let people know about, that the earliest gamer that we know of is a woman. It's a fun fact, right? Yeah. So the origins of games are difficult to kind of pin down because what we rely on as archaeologists depends on our ability to identify things in the material record. So, but for what we have been able to see ethnographically is that a lot of people play with stuff that is not detectable in the archaeological record. So a lot of games that people have played, they have just made the boards on the ground, whether scooping holes, whether that is scooping holes out of the ground or making lines on the ground, and using objects that are around them, like stones and sticks and even animal droppings, to use as pieces and dice and this kind of thing. So these are the things that we can't find archaeologically, or they're really hard to detect archaeologically. So it makes finding the origins of gaming really difficult for us. And for example, we're all used to dice as a major part of a lot of different kinds of video games, or not video games, board games, and even other tabletop games. And we're used to the easily recognizable cubes or 20-sided or 12-sided or whatever. But these are the things that people more frequently use traditionally as games, as dice. So in Latin America, specifically in Central America, they would often have beans that they would mark with a dot on one side, and you could cast them. Cowrie shells, which have a mouth side and a back side. Basically, you could use any kind of object that has 2 or more distinguishable sides to use as some kind of randomizer for play. They would split sticks in half where you have a flat side and a round side, or you could mark sticks very simply in different ways so that you could distinguish them. Or another very popular method worldwide, which Barbara is very familiar with, of course, are the astragalus bones, which are the ankle bones of hooved animals. They usually use sheep or goat. They have 4 very distinct sides that can be used as a kind of 4-sided dice. Maybe even earlier than the stuff that we have seen, the actual identifiable board, maybe there are traces for games even before this. There's a very famous site called Çatalhöyük in Turkey that has a prehistoric site. You can see it's going back all the way to the 7th and 8th millennium BCE. But they found a ton of these astral bones. Now, it's very hard to tell if these things are used for games or some kind of play, or if they have some other kind of ritual purpose, or if they were just for meat production. But there are, because of the way that people played and the materials people use for play, these are questions that have to kind of be dealt with when thinking about the origins of gaming, because what we see in the archaeological record is the material manifestation of game boards, not necessarily the earliest instances of play. So there are some very kind of important differences between the kinds of games that we're talking about when we're talking about traditional games that are part of cultural heritage versus the kind of game that you go to the store and buy from a box. These here are the 4 game boards that were found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and of course, Monopoly. I didn't know that Monopoly had a Tyrannosaurus Rex now. It's interesting. That was new to me. So basically the distinction here that we kind of used in a digital looting project, and we're start thinking about how these kinds of games differ, really kind of functions in the way that people learn them, experience them, and teach them to one another. So for these kinds of traditional games that existed before the 19th century, where you get people who are really inventing games to be sold, and because they need to sell games to someone in a store somewhere else, they have to write down the rules so that someone can learn the game on their own by reading them. So much of human history of learning games was not. That process is very alien to what people have really done in the past, where people would teach each other to play games. So if you think back to some of the traditional games that you might have learned growing up, things like tic-tac-toe or chess or even checkers are probably not something that you learn from rules from a box. You probably learn them from your parents, your siblings, your friends, somebody that you know. So this is a really important kind of aspect of these games because because of the way that the interpersonal contact affects so many different kinds of processes. So this interpersonal contact helps games to spread through time and through space. Games are particularly amenable to this kind of spread because generally you need 2 people to play, and games function as a kind of social lubricant where people can do things. You can learn to play a game and you can interact with someone without verbal communication. So it can spread across cultural and linguistic boundaries really easily. And also where you have communities that are playing the same game and are learning kind of the game in the same way, they tend to form player communities that are playing similar games in similar ways. And these communities can be very broad or very localized as well. And games are also, once these communities form, they can become very performative, both by the people who are playing them, but also in the reception of that performance by people who are observing people playing other games. So like in this painting, you see a Polish, I don't think he was Polish, but it's in the Polish Museum. You see this painting by a European of people who are Turkish playing a particular game. That is the Mancala game, which is signifying Turkish identity here as something that's different from what Europeans play. So this has to do with the heritage and identity of games in that way. And this is a map from our database. This kind of shows the way that games can be spread all across the world. These are all Mancala games. These are kind of the earliest origin point, the earliest points where we have evidence for each of these different Mancala games. We have a lot in Africa, but it's also has spread through different parts of the world and through different kinds of ways. You know, we have it in Southeast Asia and in Indonesia, through West Asia, Central Asia, and brought to the Americas, not because people brought the game there themselves, but it existed in the mind, and this is important for later, it existed in the minds of enslaved Africans who were brought over to the Americas and then played there. So there was a material element that was absent there, but the game was still played, which is something that's very different from how a lot of games are played today. And there's been this process of teaching a game from one person to another leads to a process called cultural transmission, where through the act of teaching and learning games, as like in a kind of an evolutionary process, through time, the game changes, whether that's through kinds of misunderstandings, where, as I kind of mentioned earlier, where you might teach a game to somebody, but they don't learn all of the rules because a certain situation didn't come up. So they may make up a new one to do that, to account for that situation when they then encounter it playing it later. Or they may change a rule because they don't like it. These are kinds of processes that happen as games are transmitted through time and through place. And you can see this visualized here from Thierry's article in Mexico in the Southwest United States, where you have games that started in the Maya area and kind of were transmitted up through the through Mexico and into the Southwest and even the plains of the United States, where basically the same idea of the game changes the configuration of the board and also some of the rules that are more intangible. And then that over there is kind of a representation of the changes in the game of 20 squares in West Asia and Egypt. And this process is, I should say that there are certain of these commercial games that do exist also go through this process. Like was mentioned earlier, Monopoly, nobody ever reads the rules in the box. You learn it from somebody, and you have house rules, you know, whether you're putting everything in free parking or not, and most people don't do what's in the rules, which is where if you land on an unbought property and you don't buy it, it's supposed to be auctioned off to everybody. Nobody plays by that rules, really. Or also Uno, which there was recently a big uproar on social media that you can't play a draw two on a draw two, according to the official rules, but so many people play it that way. So there is an interesting connection and overlap between these commercial games and when did they then start to become heritage games in their own right. That has to do with, you know, how kind of embedded and how widely played they are. But games, so the games themselves are, you know, once games become embedded in these player communities, they become a kind of intangible cultural heritage. And so these player communities can often really overlap with cultures. We have a lot of people from Greece here. We know that Tavli is very connected to Greek identity, especially Greek male identity, and the performance of that and how, you know, how that gets enacted. And that's also, there are also connections between place, where it's done in the caffeine, the public kind of coffee place, and, you know, all the other kinds of things that go on. And this is true for many other games as well. And these games can last for many generations. So games are not just something that people do for fun. It's part of who they are and how they experience and express their culture. But it's also a part of but traditional games are threatened in a lot of different ways. So because of this process where people are learning games from person to person, nobody really bothers up until, well, you start to see it really taking off in kind of the 17th or the 18th and 19th century. People really didn't write down the rules for games very much. You just knew how to play these games because you were taught them. And so you find some texts, usually a lot of the texts that we have dealing with historical periods, and especially is going further back, when people are talking about rules, they're using it as a metaphor in some kind of literary reference. So you see a lot of chess used in a lot of ways in this manner, and we'll see a couple of examples throughout the course of the afternoon. There are also, so people are not writing down the games, and of course games wax and wane in popularity, but there are also other kinds of processes cultural processes that go on that also threaten the preservation of some of these games. So you see some of them listed here: colonialism, capitalism, globalization. We'll talk about some of those examples of those, but also some of the destruction of ancient sites where there is evidence for games as they are destroyed. Also the heritage and the evidence for games are destroyed. So here you see over on the right, there was some research done by Alex de Vogt at the Temple of Baal in Palmyra in Syria, where he documented all of the graffiti games that were there. And then of course, recently, ISIS blew the temple up. So luckily, this stuff was documented before that happened, but as conflicts in different places are threatening cultural heritage, also our knowledge of games is also being threatened. So one of the things that we deal with is the issue of preservation of the actual artifacts. So even when we do have materials that survive, sometimes they are not complete. So this is an example of a board that was found at Dholavira in India, a really old example that probably belongs to the game of 20 squares or the Royal Game of War, whichever version you want to assign to it, because it has this kind of neck that is very specific for that game. We think there could also be other possibilities based on what's, because that's missing, but this is what we think it was. Also, there's the famous rules tablet where some of the rules for this game was written on a tablet, but the tablet itself is damaged. So even if stuff does survive, it doesn't always survive in a complete fashion. We also have these examples. So this example is an example in stone, which is somewhat unusual. It's not super uncommon, but it's not super common for people to make games out of stone. More frequently, people would make games out of wood or textiles or something that is perishable. And sometimes you can see remnants of the game. So this was from a Roman era site in Britain, where you can see the bronze hinges, outlines of the board itself and the pieces that were laid on it, but the wood itself that made up the board has disintegrated. And then of course we see this again, but then there are sometimes things that we just never will find archaeologically because people play on boards like this. One of the examples, so we also know that even in the early days of, well, in the 19th century, when people from Europe and the United States were encountering indigenous peoples around the world, and they were documenting a lot of the games that were present in those places. Because what's interesting, you see people don't really write about the rules that they have for their own traditional games, but when they would encounter people playing, other people playing different traditional games, they're like, oh, let's describe this weird game that these people are playing, because they're not familiar with it. So, but already in that time period, we see evidence that some of these traditional games were being replaced. So this is a Maori game from New Zealand that was really first kind of appears in the academic literature in the late 19th century. But even at that point in time in the literature, they say that it had been kind of falling out of popularity in New Zealand because they were favoring more of the European games that were being brought there by the British. So it's these issues of the game is a performance, and in certain time periods and in certain places, there's a pressure to perform a certain kind of identity, and where being at that point in time, performing the identity of being indigenous was not as beneficial, let's say, when you're in a colonial environment. So by playing European games, that kind of shows that you're going along and not collaborating, but what's the word I'm looking for? You're kind of acquiescing to the colonial situation. So what we have to do in order to kind of understand what we know about these games, because we have the archaeological evidence, we have all kinds of different evidence, and we have people who are very interested in games, who have done research on games. We have to do a historiography of how we know what we know about these rules. And especially nowadays, because there have been a lot of people, like I mentioned before, in archaeology and in other cultural approaches to games, people or cultural approaches to the past, people have kind of de-emphasized games as an important aspect of research. So a lot of people didn't do a lot of good, well-informed, data-driven, theoretically motivated research on games, but there are huge gaming communities who are really interested in games, so they have done kind of their research on their own. And this has kind of appeared in certain different ways, and I want to give you an example of one way that this has kind of become more or less difficult. So this guy, H.J.R. Murray, was one of kind of the early people who really was interested in documenting a lot of kinds of games and describing them. He wrote in, I think it was 1913, he wrote a history of chess, where he kind of went through this big, massive volume about all of how chess spread around the world, starting in India. And then about 40 years later, he wrote another game, a history of board games other than chess, which is everything else. And basically what he did was he compiled a lot of the archaeological and mostly ethnographic and historical records that were available to him at the time, and described what all of these games around the world were. And they're both very easily available. You can still buy these books today. And it has become a resource both for people who are interested in games and also researchers. One game that is in Murray's book that is, I see a lot, I'll talk about a lot, and it is on that pillar of academic research, Wikipedia, which describes this game, Achi. It's a game from Ghana, as this board. It's basically, Three Men's Morris, which is basically a version of tic-tac-toe where you move after the pieces are played. They describe it as this game here. It's also on Board Game Geek with the same description, except they say that there's two versions. In the other version, you have 4 pieces instead of 3 per player. But okay. If you go back to Murray's description of it, he describes it here. Talks about, he says that there's 6 pieces for each player, and it's in the section of 5 or 6 men's Morris, which is played on board E, which is this. So it's a completely different game that is described in Murray's source material. And his source for this is his son, who was working for the colonial administration in British West Africa at the time. So at some point, somebody misunderstood what was going on in Murray's work and repeated it, and now that has been repeated over and over again as the truth. But that is in direct conflict with what the actual source says. And so this is why it's important to kind of document the historiography of how we know what we know about these games. So there are lots of avenues for us to explore this. One of them is artifacts. So they're the actual things that people use to play, which can be the boards, the pieces, the dice. If they're well sourced, we can tell things about the date and the location. We can tell if it's complete, we can tell things about the geometry of the board, whether some of the spaces are marked that might tell us if something is supposed to happen when pieces land on them, and also the form and number of the equipment. And you can also tell some social things such as the status of people who were playing. This is Tutankhamun's board, so that tells us that, you know, wealthy people were playing this, and also things about gender and space, where people were playing. Sometimes you can also tell things, that I kind of alluded to that in the other section, but this is a very small piece of a game that is actually the same game as this board, and we can tell that because of the markings that appear here. We know from having many examples that these markings are only found on the game board Senate. So even if we have a small piece, we can tell something about what the game is sometimes. We also have a lot of textual evidence. One of the earliest kind of collections of game rules are the Book of Games from Alfonso X of Castile, who wrote about various games that were played in Spain at the time. We have texts that mention a game or discuss the rules. They tell us about how to play it, sometimes what the equipment is, and also where and when these games were played. And sometimes you can also infer things about status, gender, and where people were playing, especially if there are illuminations on the manuscripts like you see here. Here's kind of a quick example of the rules. One of the earliest texts that have a somewhat, I don't want to say complete, but quite a number of the rules are represented on this tablet. This is for the game of 20 squares. It was on this tablet written in 177 BCE. That's the board for the game, but it describes 5 different pieces, the kind of dice, the astragals that I showed before. It tells you how to move, and that on the rosettes, which are these marked spaces, that it basically tells you that something good happens. But this is kind of in poetic language, and it's being used as a metaphor, so you have to kind of infer things from it. And then it tells you who wrote the document and when. So this gives you an idea of some of the things that we can find. This is, especially for the ancient world, one of probably the most complete games text that we have, and it is not itself not very complete, not a very complete description of the rules. We also have another example. We'll talk a bit more about it later. The game of Ludus Trunculorum, which is one of the ancient games that we have the most amount of information about the rules for. So it's used in various Latin sources as a metaphor for various different things. So we know that the pieces move in a straight line. We know that if if you surround 2 of your enemy's pieces on opposite sides, you capture that piece. We know that the board is a square or a rectangle. We know that you can move forwards and backwards. We know that the point of the game is to capture more pieces than your opponent. So we'll talk a little bit more about a case study with this game, but this kind of shows that like we have some information about rules for ancient games, but there's never like a rule set that says, okay, here's how you play Ludus Trunculorum. We also have artistic depictions which show people playing games. It can be difficult to deal with because of the ways that art was made in different time periods. We have this kind of sense now that art should be representative of what was happening, but that was not necessarily the goal of the artist. So you see things like early modern painters who show a chessboard that only has 6 by 6 squares. They're not trying to accurately depict the board. They're trying to just communicate that that's chess, and having the exact board isn't necessary to show chess. So But what art can be really important for showing is like the context in which people are playing games. So this ancient Egyptian tomb painting, which has people here playing Senet and Mehen, and we know because the hieroglyphs tell us what games are being played. But this shows the game being played in the context of a ritual for the funeral of the person whose tomb this is, in honor of the goddess Hathor. So it's a very religious and celebratory kind of context. And yeah, and like I said, you have, the board isn't necessarily always, they don't make it easy to determine what game it necessarily is unless they say. We know that this is probably representing the game of Senet because we know the scene that this depicts is from the Book of the Dead, where Senet is played at one stage in that text. And also we have this famous ship model that has people playing a board game, where people have said in the past that this is the game of Senet, but the board doesn't. Senet has 3 rows of squares. That's not what's depicted on the board, but okay, so maybe it's not Senet, but maybe the artist doesn't know what Senet is, and that's not what's important for that artist to depict it. So art can be difficult sometimes. And of course, ethnography, when people go and document games. These can tell us a lot of information, but it's really variable depending on how interested the ethnographer is on actually documenting the game itself. So we have some examples where someone has gone and played a game. In this game is a Mancala style game from Sumatra, I believe. Oh no. Yeah, or Borneo. And relays a very detailed list of rules on how to play this game. But you have other descriptions of past games. This is from a dictionary where it just says this is describing games in Peru. It says, okay, there you have a game called Taptana, but that just means alquerque or toy, or Taptana or comino, another name for a game is chess, backgammon, or alquerque. Yeah, I've seen that too. Yeah, or playing piece. So you'll see a lot of times the ethnographers will say, okay, this game is, it's their chess game or it's their backgammon game. But what does that mean? Does that mean the game is like chess or like backgammon? Or does that just mean it's a board game? So it's really unclear a lot of the time what they actually mean. And yeah, so a lot of the times ethnographers, their primary goal is not to describe the games. It's kind of an aside that they say, okay, look at this funny thing that they do. And they describe it in kind of a cursory manner. So we often don't get a full picture of what's going on. So that's all of that is how we kind of are gathering information, and sort of even in the kind of the cultural heritage sphere, board games have been less kind of recognized as a part of cultural heritage. We see here's a screenshot of the UNESCO site where, as part of their intangible heritage initiative, they recognize traditional sports and games as a very important part of this. And there are organizations, local organizations all around the world that are focused on preserving these kinds of play. But there's only one board game on the UNESCO list of cultural heritage. It's this one, which depending on how you describe it, it could be 3 games, but it's Togo's Comelec, which translates to 9 holes. It's basically a Mancala style game that's played in Central Asia and in Turkey as well. But yeah, so this is the only one that has really been inscribed on this list to preserve games. So there really is kind of a need to do this. And so one of the goals of the Digital Looting Project, you've heard us talking about this, was to start a centralized location to gather this information about what we know about the rules and how we know it, to put all that information there so that it's accessible to people, so that they can have a place to go to find the rules for these games, and also, all of the sources for it. And so we built the database, which I will show you in a little bit. We also have to deal, as we were building this database and as we were, because the database itself is the source of the information for the games that are implemented in Ludi software that Eric will talk about tomorrow, we have to deal with the question of what is a game and how do we divide games? Where do we draw the line between what is one game and what is another game? So for example, drafts games or checkers, if you want, there's a wide variety of different ways to play this kind of game. But it's kind of, the question is, how do you say, okay, this is this drafts game, this is this drafts game. So there are lots of different variations of ways to play this with the size of the board, the number of pieces, whether you can capture multiple pieces in one turn, whether you're forced to capture the most pieces in one turn, whether you can promote your piece in the middle of a turn when it ends on the opposite side that you started on, or if you have to land there at the final turn, different ways that the promoted pieces can move. There are a whole galaxy of different ways that this game can be played, and some of them are kind of formed in certain communities that play games in a certain way. So it just kind of illustrates this idea that Ulrich was showing, that there are often, and there are lots more examples of the way this happens, that there are many different ways to play what could be the same game. So this is the idea that games really exist, especially traditional games really exist in the mind, versus commercial games and especially digital games, which exist with an artifact, with a box set of rules or on a piece of software. So, and card games are one good example of games that really exist in the mind, because you buy the cards, you don't necessarily buy the rules for the game. You just play what game you know. This was a version of clustering analysis we did on all of our games. So, one way to look at it is there really are only 3 games. We kind of clustered based on the concepts that were in each of the games that were implemented in Ludi, and noticed that they grouped according to games that have a track, so a set route along which the pieces move, that use the sewing mechanism, so Mancala games, those that have a track, and dice. So mostly race games, but not all race games, because there are some capturing games that do that, and all of the games in which pieces move within a field of spaces. So within like a square or some other predetermined field where the movement isn't determined by the roll of a dice or the number of pieces in the spot. It's based on, the movement powers of the pieces. Probably not a great analytical way to split up games if you're going to create a database of just 3. So we chose, for the purpose of our research and for constructing the database, chose a granular approach where we really broke down games into basically their individual rule sets that were played individually. So we have a lot of sparse and incomplete information that doesn't always allow us to say that we have the evidence for a game that was played in one place according to certain rules. We have another piece of evidence that says another game is played according to the same rules, but we don't necessarily know that there's a connection between those two. So it was better for us analytically to split them into 2 separate games. What we decided was that any differences in the rules in different places equal different games. And identical games that appear in different cultures or at different times are different games. So if you have the same game played in, say, France, and it's also played in Japan, in the past, of course, that these are considered in the database as separate games. And that's because we want to keep them as independent entities to explore the independent histories of these games and how they got to these different places. Because you don't want to conflate the two and say that they have the same shared history, because there can be, through the process of cultural transmission, you can have convergent evolution where games can develop into the same game, but through different processes in 2 different places. So we have kind of 3 different levels in our database and in Ludi. So the game itself is kind of more of the cultural idea of what it is. So this is the Ludus Atrocularum. In the database, it has a description and pictures of the board. We have many rule sets for this. So for each game, we can attach many different rule sets for to each of them. And the purpose of this is that for a lot of the ancient games, there are a lot of people who have come up with rules based on their analysis and understanding of the evidence for those games. And we have some made by some people here in the audience. We've also created these as part of the research and experiments that we'll talk about later this afternoon, and as well as one that just has the historical information attached to them. So you can have all of these different kinds of ways to play the game attached to the same game in the Ludi software, which is nice and makes things easier for us to do research. But all of it is supported by evidence and what the map and what the evidence we have collected for this game. So for this game, this is still Ludus Atrocularum. We have 68 pieces of evidence in the database, artifacts, texts. I don't think artistic, we have some models of it, and placed geographically and chronologically, and where they were found and where those places were dated to archaeologically. So yeah, so that's how our database is kind of structured, based on this, ludemes being the individual pieces of movement, which I didn't really talk about. It will come in more importantly in the Ludi talk, maybe. But the ludeme is the idea that it's a little piece of game information, like the number of pieces, the size and shape of the board, things like this, that you combine all these things together to make a game, to make a rule set, which then is part of the game. And all of it is supported by the evidence. And we have a few minutes left, so let's actually explore the database. Let me change the Zoom share so they can see it. Not that. You have a lot of Zoom questions, okay. Okay, so Ludi.games, if you are interested to explore this at home, under games here is the, come on, there it is. So we have a lot of games implemented here that are not traditional games, such as that one there. But if we click this one, they will go away. Let's take a look at Senate, because that's what I did most of my research on. So here's the game here. We have a bunch of different rule sets that have been, so we have scholarly and suggested rule sets. Scholarly are rule sets that are made by someone who is an expert in the place or time period that the game comes from. Or we have suggested rule sets, which are from people who are more gameplay oriented, so we're more interested in playing games. And then we have different incomplete rule sets. So this one, for this game, it has a bunch of different kind of markings that are on it. We have here under concepts, where you can explore. There are, will you talk more about what concepts are now? So concepts are kind of using the ludemes that make up the games in the Ludi software. They're calculated based on to show what kinds of properties these games have, whether that's what kinds of moves and equipment are there, or how other kinds of metrics are calculated through them. And you can explore that there. That's not as exciting to me as the evidence map. So for Senate we have the most evidence for, because it's where a lot of my research is focused on. You see the evidence range, so the date range for what we know of where this game existed. And the map itself is also interactive. So you can click on the dot and it'll tell you what that is. So this is an artifact, was found in this location, dates to this time period. These are the So this was a board, so we know that it had the 3x10 board and where it was marked, a little description of what it is, and the sources for it. And then down here, let's see if we, yeah, Firth. And then down here, we have a list of the sources. So that was Firth. Let's hope this one is there. And hope it loads, because these links might be a little bit old. But these are, so this is basically the bibliography of all of the evidence and where that information came from. And I think that's a big file, so it's going to take a while to load. So let's try something else. No. Oh, if it's not available digitally, it will take you to WorldCat, so you can find it in a library near you. I'm just trying to find one that is there. Yeah, so this is the excavation report for one of the archaeological sites, and then it'll tell you if you're look at that piece of evidence, it'll show you where it is. We have other capabilities in the database. So for example, the game of 58 holes is the only one that we've used this for. You can add pictures. So that's an example from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. We also have here the concept search, which is interesting. So if you are looking for a game, yeah, I mean, if I shut this, well, we'll let that load. We'll let that load.
Just your internet, which is super.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, we have, here we go. This is the world map, which has all of the different, the point where the oldest piece of evidence for each game comes from. So you can see, as I was mentioning before, we have a lot of coverage in Western Europe, less so in Central and Eastern Europe. We have a lot in India. There's a lot, and there was one publication with a lot of games from Mongolia, but in comparison to the other places, Japan and China are less covered than they should be. Of course, the traditional games of the Americas are not well documented, so they're also missing a lot of information. This can also be sorted. We have sort of categorized the games based on their game mechanics. So for instance, hunt games where you have one person plays as the prey and the other person plays as the hunters, basically. You know, race games where the goal is to reach the end of the track. Sewing, which are the Mancala games. War games, which are basically the goal is to capture all of your opponent's pieces. So these are ways to visualize this. You can also use the slider to adjust the time. And since we can't adjust our real time, maybe I should take some questions now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is the mic?
You want the mic?
Do you have any question before I go to the Zoom session? No. So I have many.
Ulrich has.
Sorry. Didn't see.
It's a very simple.
Yeah, it's a very simple question. What happens to the Ludi website and the database now that the digital Ludim project is over?
Yeah, so we are going to continue it. Eric probably knows more of the details of what's going on. Maybe you do.
It's hard for me to answer, but to sum up, I'm trying to get all this data in my institution to just continue the project with Ludi and everything. So that means that all that we have currently at Maastricht could be in my institution in the future, but I cannot promise it for the moment.
It's not as scary as you make it sound. I have all of the data, and
sure.
the data is all there. Whether we might need to have a different kind of interface to, kind of re-implement the database and have a different server to use it. But yeah, it will exist.
Yes. Maastricht University is helping us for that, yes.
Yeah.
But that should be another institution and just still online and everything.
And something
in the near future, but we'll see.
And something that we really are or at least I am, and I think was one of the goals, it should be one of the goals of working group 2 is to improve this. So it may not even, it doesn't even necessarily need to look like this in this form. So we need to like explore things like linked open data and all kinds of ways to connect this data to other kinds of data sets that are out there. Also, we also need to, I think, restructure the database in a lot of ways because it is primarily constructed to make the Ludi software functional, which is a good goal, but it's not necessarily the best goal for representing cultural heritage. So there needs, and one thing that we want to do is develop a different kind of version of this that is more focused toward representing the cultural aspects of the games than the functional.
But who is hosting the Ludin project at the moment?
The Ludium project itself is over. So
It's over, but
but we will,
But who pays for to put it on the internet?
Currently, they are at Maastricht University. There are hosts still there, so everything is there at Maastricht, and the server is also at Maastricht. But we are thinking at maybe moving it to somewhere else to have more administration power, let's say, on it. But this is going on, so I can't make any promise. But maybe that should be done.
Still, the University of Maastricht is
For the moment,
still
yes.
paying for it.
Yeah, probably.
yeah.
Yeah, the bills is in continue, signing all.
Yeah, but it's like the homes website we had then at one time with all the games from Holland, which Rob van Linden put on Homes. So that was the historical overview of Dutch board games, and we put it into at the website of Brugge.
Mhm.
So Brugge just have a website of all these games, their own games, but also Homes at it.
Mhm.
And I'm curious about who's where this stays and where it belongs to. Who owns these information? That is important, I think.
It is, and that's something that we are exploring, and we have a very vested interest in making this a long-term thing that exists. So yeah, we are.
Because I know Cameron, of course, and you have made all this information possible. But who owns it at least? And is it from the University of Maastricht? Is it from? Yes. From who is it?
Currently, it's Maastricht University, which is.
But I mean, the database itself and the server itself that makes this functioning is at Maastricht University, but the data itself is open access. It's in a publicly available depository, so people can take this data and make their own database out of it if they wanted to or needed to. So the data itself isn't really owned. It's just this kind of manifestation of it.
But yeah, if we pick about database will still be alive, I guess, because
Because I mean we need it.
yeah, that is fine. For the data itself, everything is fine. Do you have yes?
Yes, another question. Of course, what we saw until now, it's exclusively board games.
Yes.
So this is a question also to the GameTable project in general. Do we only talk about board games, or do we talk about other games than board games also as well?
Yeah, and I mean, my expertise is in board games, and the digital looting project was focused on board games, so that's what we talked about. But we explicitly want GameTable to expand beyond that. We want to include card games and all forms of tabletop games, because we didn't have the time, and it didn't really fit the research focus or questions that we had at the time to expand beyond board games. But that is something that we absolutely want to do. Yeah.
So card games, domino games, mahjong, all of that will also be included in GameTable.
And especially, any games that can be modeled in the Ludi software, right? So it's games that don't involve any kind of physics.
Yeah.
as far as like things like, yeah,
To be clear, card games cannot be done currently in 2D, but will be.
the possibility is
Yeah.
there. Yeah, it's just not.
I think, he can tell more about card games because there's a lot also on card games on the internet.
Just the thing to say a little more about the words that you use. I don't like the word tabletop games because billiards or carom are tabletop games, but they are not mind games. I much prefer to distinguish between mind games, the games who are involved in their study, and body games. If we are to focus on mind games, of course, card games have to be included, but sorry, they are much more difficult to analyze than board games, and this is why we started with board games. I'm thinking about the classification of card games, which is still to be really invented. We have tried to classify card games as we did for board games, as Murray and others did for board games, but it's extremely difficult. And because they are games of incomplete information, it's probably something which will need much more work.